I am giving you exactly 24 hours to remove those flying menaces, or I will have them forcefully exterminated. Do you hear me? If you've never had a middle-aged woman in a matching pastel tennis skirt set scream at you over a 4-foot vinyl fence while you are wearing what is essentially a mesh-faced astronaut suit, let me tell you, it is a profoundly surreal experience. It was a blisteringly hot Tuesday afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina. The kind of humid, heavy southern heat that makes the air feel like thick soup. I was standing in the back corner of my own private, fully fenced-in backyard. I was wearing a full-body, stark white canvas beekeeping suit. It was zipped all the way up to my chin, the wide-brimmed hood pulled over my head, the black mesh veil dropping down over my face. My hands were encased in thick goatskin gloves, and in my right hand, I was holding a stainless steel smoker that was currently puffing out this incredibly soothing, earthy scent of smoldering dry pine needles. Behind me, resting on a perfectly leveled foundation of cinder blocks, were 2 absolutely gorgeous, brand new, unpainted cedar Langstroth beehives. They smelled like fresh wood and wax. And in front of me, separated by that pristine white fence, was Brenda. Brenda was the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. And right now, Brenda was vibrating at a frequency that I honestly thought might shatter glass. Her eyes were bugging out of her head. Her face was flushed a dangerous shade of magenta. And she was gripping her signature aluminum clipboard so hard her knuckles were practically glowing in the sun. "Brenda," I said. I tried to keep my voice as calm and level as humanly possible, though it was slightly muffled by the mesh of my veil. "Take a breath. They are Italian honeybees, Apis mellifera. They are incredibly docile. They are literally just out here looking for pollen and nectar. If you stop aggressively waving your arms around like you're trying to land a 747 on a tarmac, they won't even realize you exist." "They are unauthorized backyard livestock," she shrieked. She slammed her perfectly manicured index finger onto her clipboard, right onto a freshly printed, violently pink citation slip. "It is a direct, flagrant violation of Section 4, Paragraph B of the Whispering Pines Community Covenant. You did not submit an architectural review form for these wooden eyesores, and you absolutely did not get board approval to harbor a deadly swarm of pests on this property." I let out a long, heavy sigh. I squeezed the leather bellows of my smoker just a fraction of an inch. A tiny, lazy puff of gray smoke drifted over the fence line. Brenda physically recoiled, staggering back half a step as if I had just deployed military-grade tear gas. "They aren't livestock, Brenda," I said, shifting my weight. "And they definitely aren't pests. They're bugs. They're bees." "They are a massive liability," she countered, pointing her pen at me like a weapon. "Think of the property values. Think of the children walking on the sidewalks. Think of the Lush Lawns program." Ah, yes. There it was. The absolute bane of my existence. The Lush Lawns program. You have to understand the context here. I mean, I moved to Charlotte about 2 months before this ridiculous standoff. I bought this house in Whispering Pines because, on paper, it was perfect. It was a nice, quiet, looping subdivision. The houses were spaced out, the backyards were decently sized, and there were these massive, gorgeous, mature oak trees everywhere. It was 10 minutes from my favorite coffee shop, and 15 minutes from the highway. But I didn't fully comprehend the absolute tyrannical grip of the HOA until after I signed the mortgage. When you move into an HOA, they hand you a binder. The Whispering Pines bylaws binder was 3 inches thick. It was heavier than a car battery and twice as toxic. Most of it was the standard, boring suburban stuff, right? Don't paint your garage door neon purple, keep your trash cans out of sight from the street, don't park a rusted-out RV on your front lawn. Normal things. But buried in the middle of this massive legalistic tome was a section that the board, and specifically President Brenda, treated like a sacred, unbreakable religious doctrine. It was called the Lush Lawns Mandate. Whispering Pines had signed an exclusive, mandatory ironclad contract with a commercial landscaping company called Scorched Earth Landscaping. I'm not kidding. That was the vibe they gave off. Every single Tuesday morning, without fail, a fleet of massive white box trucks would rumble into our quiet little cul-de-sacs. Half a dozen guys wearing heavy green rubber boots, thick rubber gloves, and literal respiratory masks would jump out. They dragged these heavy-duty, high-pressure industrial hoses across our driveways, and they would proceed to absolutely blanket every single square inch of grass in the entire subdivision with a neon green, highly concentrated, toxic chemical weed killer. I literally cannot accurately describe the smell to you. It was this horrific, eye-watering mixture of industrial bleach, artificial mint, and pure chemical death. You couldn't open your windows on Tuesdays. If you walked outside to get your mail while it was drying, your eyes would start burning. I hated it with a burning passion. I hated the smell. I hated that the chemicals made the grass feel stiff and crunchy under my bare feet instead of soft. And most of all, I absolutely hated that I had to pay a mandatory, non-negotiable $100 a month directly to the HOA just to fund this weekly poisoning of the earth. But it was baked right into the bylaws. You couldn't opt out. If you refused to let the Scorched Earth crew spray your yard, the HOA fined you $200 a week for failure to maintain community standards. I'm a pretty laid-back guy, but being forced to pay for something I actively despised was driving me crazy. I needed a hobby, something to keep my mind off the fact that my front yard was a toxic wasteland, something entirely for myself. So I decided to get into beekeeping. I didn't just rush into it. I'm a meticulous guy. I spent 3 weeks researching. I read every single line of the Charlotte City ordinances regarding urban agriculture. It turns out, keeping a couple of beehives in your backyard is completely, 100% legal within the city limits. The city only requires that you provide a constant, clean water source for the bees so they don't go swarming your neighbor's pool, and that you keep the hives a minimum of 10 feet away from the property lines. That was it. Then, I opened up that massive 3-inch thick Whispering Pines HOA binder. I spent an entire Sunday afternoon reading it cover to cover, scanning for any mention of insects. The bylaws had an entire section on animals. It explicitly banned poultry, swine, cattle, horses, and exotic dangerous pets, including but not limited to venomous snakes and large felines. It had strict rules about how many dogs you could own, 2, and what breeds were restricted. But it said absolutely nothing. 0, zilch, about bugs. It didn't mention bees. It didn't mention butterflies. It didn't mention ladybugs. As far as the HOA covenant was concerned, insects did not exist. I had found my loophole. I went all in. I ordered the high-end cedar hives online. I spent an entire weekend assembling the frames, making sure every joint was perfectly snug. I set up a beautiful little bird bath filled with pebbles and fresh water right next to where the hives would go, creating the perfect bee watering hole. Then I drove out to a local apiary just past the city limits and bought 2 nucs, nucleus colonies. Basically, starter boxes filled with a mated queen and a few thousand eager, fuzzy worker bees. I brought them home, suited up, and transferred them into my beautiful new cedar boxes, nestled right under the shade of my biggest oak tree in the far back corner of my yard, well over 15 feet from the property line. For 3 glorious weeks, it was absolute heaven. I would wake up early, grab a cup of coffee, and just stand in my backyard watching them work. The way they moved was mesmerizing. They were so focused, so busy flying out into the neighborhood to gather pollen and zooming back in. It was the most peaceful I had felt since moving into this tightly wound neighborhood. But of course, peace in an HOA never lasts. It's like a law of physics. Brenda lived 3 houses down and 1 street over, meaning her backyard backed up diagonally to my neighbor's yard. She was the neighborhood watcher, the kind of woman who practically patrolled the sidewalks with a ruler to make sure nobody's grass was growing 1/8 of an inch past the mandated height. Eventually, she must have noticed the bees flying over the fences, or maybe she was literally looking through binoculars. Either way, she found out. Which brings us right back to this exact moment, standing by the fence on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, with Brenda screaming at me while I held my smoker. "I am citing you for an unauthorized, unapproved structure, creating a public nuisance, and harboring dangerous wildlife," Brenda spat, pulling the pink citation slip off her clipboard with a sharp, ripping sound. She brandished it at me like a sword. "That is $50 for the wooden boxes. That is $100 for the noise violation, because they buzz, and I can hear them buzzing from the sidewalk. And that is $200 for endangering the health and safety of the community." "Brenda," I said, leaning casually against the handle of my hive tool, "first of all, you absolutely cannot hear them from the sidewalk. The sidewalk is 60 feet away on the other side of my house. You are literally trespassing in Dave's azalea bushes right now, just to look over this section of my fence." She completely ignored the trespassing accusation. She aggressively jammed the pink slip through the slats of the white vinyl fence, letting it flutter down into my grass. "You have 24 hours to remove them from this subdivision," Brenda commanded, her voice dropping into this creepy, authoritative tone that she clearly thought sounded intimidating. "If those boxes are not gone by tomorrow evening, I am calling the Charlotte Police Department to have you cited for endangerment. And then, I am having chem-scorched earth landscaping come back here to fully fumigate your entire yard. We will bill your account for the extermination fee." I froze. I literally stopped breathing for a second. Underneath the heavy canvas of my bee suit, I felt a sudden, very cold spike of absolute rage. She wasn't just handing out stupid, petty fines anymore. She was openly threatening to send a crew of guys in hazmat suits into my private, fenced-in backyard to systematically poison and murder tens of thousands of harmless, essential honeybees. My bees. The bees I had spent money on, the bees I had painstakingly settled, fed, and checked on every single day, and she was going to charge me $1,000 for the privilege of executing them. "You are not bringing a chemical crew into this yard," I said, my voice dropping all the conversational lightness. It was flat, hard. "They are legal. The city allows them. The bylaws do not prohibit them. If you send someone onto my property to spray poison, I will consider it destruction of private property." "Read the bylaws, you arrogant little man," Brenda sneered, adjusting her visor. "Section 9 gives the board the right to order emergency landscaping intervention if a property is deemed a threat to the lush lawns ecosystem. Your bugs are a threat. You have until tomorrow." She turned on her heel, her pristine white tennis shoes squeaking aggressively on the pavement as she pushed her way out of my neighbor's bushes, power walking back toward the street. I stood there for a long time. I set the smoker down on a cinder block. I slowly unzipped my veil and pulled the hood back, letting the hot, humid Charlotte air hit my face. I looked down at the bright pink citation slip resting in the grass. $350 in fines, just for having a hobby. I looked back at my hives. A little worker bee, its back legs completely loaded with bright yellow pollen, did a messy, looping landing onto the bottom board and scurried inside the hive. They were totally oblivious to the fact that a suburban dictator had just put a hit out on them. I wasn't going to let her do it. I simply wasn't. I walked into my house, stripped off the hot bee suit, poured myself a massive glass of ice water, and sat down at my kitchen island. I picked up my phone and stared at it. I knew that HOAs wielded an ungodly amount of power. They are basically unregulated micro-governments that can place liens on your mortgage, foreclose on your home, and bleed you dry with legal fees. I knew that fighting an HOA over bylaws was usually a losing battle because the contracts are written specifically to give the board all the leverage. But I also knew one other very important thing. HOAs are just private corporations. They are run by bored people with too much time on their hands. They are not the actual government, and they absolutely, definitively cannot supersede local, state, or federal law. If Brenda wanted to play the legal threat game, I was going to play it right back. But I wasn't going to use her stupid 3-inch binder. I was going to use the real law. I cracked my knuckles, opened my laptop, and started typing. I mean, I didn't even exactly know what I was looking for at first. I just opened a blank browser tab and started blindly Googling things like HOA Law North Carolina, can my HOA legally kill my pets, and how to sue an HOA president for emotional damage. I spent roughly 4 hours tumbling down the most boring, soul-crushing rabbit hole of legal jargon on the entire internet. Have you ever actually tried to read property law? It is literally designed to make you fall asleep so the lawyers can take your money while you're unconscious. I was reading through endless PDF files of North Carolina court precedents, trying to find some kind of ruling that said an HOA couldn't destroy private property. The problem I kept running into was that HOA covenants are essentially treated like binding contracts that you voluntarily sign when you buy the house. Courts generally hate interfering with them. Unless an HOA is violating the Fair Housing Act or doing something explicitly unconstitutional, judges usually just shrug and say, "Hey, you signed the binder." By 1 a.m., my eyes were burning, I was exhausted, and I still didn't have a bulletproof shield for my bees. I closed my laptop, went to bed, and just stared at the ceiling, honestly dreading the next day. Wednesday dawned bright, humid, and stressful. I actually work from home. I do freelance data analysis, which usually means my days are super relaxed. Not this Wednesday. I spent the entire day practically glued to my back window, watching the street, waiting for Brenda to make good on her threat. Every time a delivery truck or a loud car drove past, my heart would jump into my throat, thinking it was the chem-scorched earth hit squad arriving early. The bees, meanwhile, were having a fantastic day. I watched them dragging in these massive, bright orange clumps of pollen on their back legs. They were completely clueless that their entire existence was currently the subject of a massive suburban turf war. By 4 p.m., I was starting to think maybe Brenda had just been blowing hot air. Maybe she had realized that sending a chemical spray crew to kill bugs wasn't actually an emergency. Then, at exactly 5:15 p.m., a white Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department cruiser rolled slowly down Oakmont Drive and parked directly at the end of my driveway. I let out a long, heavy breath. Honestly, I couldn't believe she had actually done it. She actually called the police over honeybees. I opened my front door and stepped out onto the porch just as 2 officers were climbing out of the cruiser. They did not look like men who were preparing to face down a lethal biohazard. They looked like 2 guys who were at the very tail end of a 12-hour shift in 90-degree heat, and were completely, utterly over it. The driver, a taller, slightly older officer with a heavy utility belt, wiped sweat from his forehead and slowly walked up my driveway. The younger officer followed a few steps behind, looking at a notepad. "Hey there," the older officer said. He didn't rest his hand on his weapon or anything. He just hooked his thumbs into his belt and looked at me with this expression of profound exhaustion. "Are you the homeowner?" "I am," I said, leaning against one of the wooden pillars of my porch. "I'm guessing you're here because of Brenda?" The younger officer checked his notepad. "Dispatch got a call from a Brenda. Last name's illegible, honestly. She's the HOA president. She claimed there was a..." He squinted at his own handwriting. A dangerous, unauthorized biohazard situation occurring in your backyard, and that you were actively harboring aggressive, swarming pests that were threatening the neighborhood children. I literally had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. A biohazard situation. That is incredibly dramatic, even for her. "Sir," the older officer interrupted, his voice flat. "Do you have a swarm of killer hornets or something back there? Because dispatch made it sound like we were walking into a bad sci-fi movie, and quite frankly, if there's a giant wasp nest, I'm not going back there. We carry pepper spray, not Raid." "I don't have killer hornets, officer," I said, smiling apologetically. "I have 2 standard, beautifully maintained Langstroth beehives. They are filled with gentle Italian honeybees. I just set them up a few weeks ago so I could have fresh honey. They're located in the very back corner of my fenced-in yard, well over the city's required setback limits." The 2 officers just stopped and stared at me for a solid 5 seconds. The silence was thick. "Wait," the younger officer said, blinking. "Just regular bees? Like the kind that make honey?" "Literally just regular honeybees," I confirmed. "Would you guys like to go see them? I can grab you a veil if you're nervous, but you can stand 10 feet away and they won't even acknowledge you." The older officer let out a sigh so deep it sounded like it came from the bottom of his soul. "No, sir. I do not want to see your bees. I have zero interest in looking at your bees. What I want to know is why a grown woman called the emergency dispatch line to report a biohazard over some bugs." "Because," I explained, crossing my arms, "she hates anything that isn't explicitly approved in her 3-inch HOA binder. She told me yesterday I had 24 hours to get rid of them, or she was going to call you guys. I guess she thought you were going to come out here and what, arrest the bees? Shoot them?" The younger officer shook his head, looking down at his boots. "I cannot believe we drove all the way across town for this. Do you know how much paperwork a biohazard call generates? I mean, my God." "Look, man," the older officer said, stepping closer to the porch. "We deal with domestic disputes, we deal with break-ins, we deal with people running red lights. We do not do bug enforcement. We literally do not have a code for unauthorized insect. As far as the city of Charlotte is concerned, keeping bees is a code enforcement issue, not a criminal one. And even then, as long as you've got water for them and they aren't on the property line, it's perfectly legal." "I know," I said. "I read the city ordinances before I bought them." "Well, then you're fine legally," the officer said, turning to walk back to the cruiser. "But I'm warning you right now, this Brenda lady. She sounded completely unhinged on the dispatch recording, like literally foaming at the mouth. Since we aren't going to force you to get rid of them, she is going to escalate this. It's a civil matter between you and the HOA, and HOAs can be nasty. Just try to keep the peace, all right?" "I appreciate you guys coming out," I called after them. "Sorry she wasted your time." They just waved me off, climbed back into their sweltering cruiser, and drove away. I went back inside, feeling a momentary wave of smug satisfaction. Brenda had played her police card, and it had completely backfired. The cops had basically laughed at her. But my satisfaction lasted for exactly 12 minutes, because at 5:27 p.m., my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a new email notification. The sender was listed as Whispering Pines HOA, Official Board Communications. I opened the email, and the smugness instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It was a formal, certified digital notice. It had Brenda's digital signature at the bottom, and it was CC'd to the entire HOA board and the property management company. To the resident at 442 Oakmont Drive, it has come to the board's attention that you have refused to comply with the official citation issued on Tuesday regarding the unauthorized insect infestation on your property. Furthermore, local law enforcement has stated they do not have the jurisdiction to forcefully remove the pests. Therefore, the board is forced to take immediate internal action to protect the community. Your continued harboring of these flying pests is an active danger to the lush lawns ecosystem and a liability to the neighborhood. As per Section 9, Emergency Landscaping Intervention, of the bylaws, the HOA is exercising its right to dispatch a specialized team to resolve the hazard. We have scheduled a crew from Chem-Scorched Earth Landscaping to enter your property this coming Friday at exactly 8 a.m. They have been contracted to apply a high-grade industrial pesticide to completely eliminate the unauthorized swarm and clear the area. The total cost of this specialized extermination service, $850, will be added directly to your HOA ledger. Do not attempt to interfere with the contractors, or you will face additional fines and potential legal action. Regards. Brenda, President, Whispering Pines, HOA. I read the email 3 times. She was actually going to do it. The cops had told her it wasn't illegal, so instead of backing down, she had completely bypassed the legal system and hired chemical mercenaries. She was going to use a loophole in the HOA bylaws, the Emergency Landscaping Intervention Clause, to force a landscaping company to come onto my private property and gas my bees to death. And she was going to make me pay $850 for it. I literally felt my hands shaking, not out of fear, but out of pure, unadulterated fury. It takes a lot to get me genuinely angry. I'm a pretty chill guy. But the arrogance of it, the absolute sociopathic entitlement to think you can just dictate the life and death of a living creature on someone else's property just because you hold a clipboard and a title in a fake neighborhood government, it broke something in my brain. I didn't reply to the email. If you ever find yourself in a malicious compliance situation, the absolute worst thing you can do is tip your hand to the enemy before the trap is set. Instead, I took my laptop, walked into my living room, sat down on the couch, and cracked my knuckles again. The gloves were off. If she wanted to use a loophole to destroy my property, I was going to find a loophole that would legally obliterate hers. I started digging again, but this time I completely abandoned HOA law. I realized that the HOA contract didn't matter. I needed something bigger. I needed a law that trumped civil contracts. I needed state and federal regulations. I started searching terms like Commercial Pesticide Applicator Laws North Carolina and How to Stop Landscapers from Spraying Chemicals. Most of the results were just advice on how to ask your neighbors nicely not to spray. Useless. Brenda didn't care about nice. But then, around 8 p.m., I stumbled onto a link for the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. More specifically, I found my way into the Plant Industry Division. I started reading through their regulatory frameworks, and my heart started beating a little faster. In North Carolina, and honestly, in a lot of states, but definitely here, agriculture is a massive, highly protected industry. The state takes farming and crops incredibly seriously. And you know what is considered an absolute pillar of the agricultural industry? Honeybees. Without bees, crops don't get pollinated. Without pollination, the agricultural sector collapses. Because of this, the state government has a vested, aggressive interest in protecting apiaries. I kept reading, clicking through densely formatted government web pages, until I hit the absolute holy grail of my entire existence. It was a program called the North Carolina Apiary Registration. Here is the brilliant, beautiful reality of this program. The state allows any beekeeper, whether you have 500 commercial hives or literally just 2 boxes in your suburban backyard, to voluntarily register those hives with the Department of Agriculture. It's completely free. You just fill out a form, tell them where the bees are located, and they assign you an official state apiary number. Why do they do this? To track diseases, mostly. But legally? Legally, it changes everything. The second you register your backyard hives with the state, they are no longer legally considered a pet. They are no longer a hobby. They are no longer an unauthorized wooden structure. They become a formally recognized, state-protected agricultural entity. You officially become an apiary. I sat there on my couch, reading the exact phrasing of the statute, and a slow, malicious grin started spreading across my face, because becoming a registered apiary activates the trap card. It triggers the jurisdiction of a federal law known as FIFRA. FIFRA stands for the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It is enforced jointly by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the State Department of Agriculture. It is the law that dictates exactly how, where, and when commercial chemical applicators are allowed to spray their poisons. I pulled up the specific statutes regarding FIFRA and registered apiaries in North Carolina, and it was like reading poetry. Under these regulations, it is highly, strictly, federally illegal for any licensed commercial pesticide applicator to apply chemicals that are toxic to bees in a manner that endangers a registered apiary. If a state-registered apiary is present on a property, commercial landscapers are legally required to do a massive amount of compliance work before they even touch a spray wand. They have to give advanced, documented notice. They have to strictly modify their spraying schedules to only spray at night when bees aren't flying. They absolutely cannot spray if the wind is blowing over a certain speed because of chemical drift. And most importantly, they are completely forbidden from using certain highly toxic, drift-prone chemicals anywhere near the property line of the apiary. What happens if a commercial landscaping company, like, say, Chem-Scorched Earth Landscaping, violates this law? What happens if they just show up, ignore the apiary, and spray toxic weed killer all over the grass, causing chemical drift that harms the state-registered bees? The HOA doesn't find them. Brenda doesn't find them. The North Carolina Department of Agriculture finds them. And the EPA finds them. And we are not talking about a $50 pink citation slip. According to the state guidelines, a commercial applicator caught violating FIFRA around a registered apiary faces fines that can reach tens of thousands of dollars per violation. Furthermore, the state can and will immediately suspend or permanently revoke the commercial applicator license of the individual holding the hose, as well as the license of the company employing them. Without those licenses, a commercial landscaping company literally cannot legally operate. It would put them out of business overnight. I leaned back against the couch cushions and let out a laugh that was honestly a little bit unhinged. Brenda wanted to use her HOA contractor to poison my bees on Friday morning. She had no idea the absolute hellfire she was about to walk into. I didn't just have a shield anymore. I had a legally binding, federally backed, state-enforced nuke. I immediately clicked the link to download the apiary registration forms. I filled them out right there on my laptop, typing furiously. I put in my address, the number of hives, the type of bees. I saved the PDF to my desktop. But then I realized a massive logistical problem. It was currently Wednesday night at 9:30 p.m. Brenda's hit squad was scheduled to arrive on Friday at 8 a.m. If I put this registration form in the mail tomorrow morning, it wouldn't even reach the Department of Agriculture in Raleigh until Monday. It would take weeks to process. I would be legally right, but my bees would be dead on Friday. I needed protection now. I needed this apiary registered and legally recognized within 36 hours. I needed a guy on the inside. I went back to the Department of Agriculture website and dug into the contact directory for the plant industry division. I scrolled down past the bureaucrats in Raleigh and looked for the field staff. The state is divided into regions, and each region has a dedicated state apiary inspector. I found the inspector for the Western Piedmont region, which included Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. His name was listed as Henry Hank Miller. Next to his name was a state-issued cell phone number and a note that said, "For emergency disease reporting or immediate pesticide drift incidents, contact the inspector directly." I figured an attempted hit job by a rogue HOA president qualified as an immediate pesticide incident. I grabbed my phone, punched in the number, and saved it to my contacts. It was too late to call him tonight, but I set an alarm for 7 a.m. on Thursday. I slept like a baby that night. The anxiety was completely gone. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect of Brenda's impending downfall. Thursday morning, the alarm went off. I rolled out of bed, grabbed a cup of coffee, and at exactly 7:31 a.m., I hit dial on Hank the inspector's number. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. "State Apiary Inspector, this is Hank," a voice answered. It was a thick, gravelly, deep southern drawl. He sounded like a man who spent his entire life outdoors and didn't have time for nonsense. "Hi, Hank," I said, trying to sound as professional but urgent as possible. "My name is Geyser. I live in Charlotte in a subdivision called Whispering Pines. I have a bit of a massive, time-sensitive emergency situation on my hands, and I desperately need the state's help." Hank let out a low grunt on the other end of the line. "What kind of emergency, son? You got a foul brood outbreak in your hives?" "No, sir. The bees are perfectly healthy. My emergency is my homeowners association." There was a pause. "Son, I'm an agricultural inspector, not a marriage counselor for neighborhoods. If your HOA doesn't like your hives, you're going to have to take that up with a civil lawyer." "I know that, Hank," I pressed on quickly. "But the HOA isn't just complaining. The HOA president has officially hired a commercial pesticide applicator, Chem Scorched Earth Landscaping, and ordered them to come onto my property tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. to forcefully spray an industrial chemical blanket over my entire yard, specifically to exterminate my 2 hives." Another pause. The silence on the phone was heavy. "Did you say?" Hank's voice dropped an octave, losing any trace of morning weariness and replacing it with sharp, intense focus. "That an HOA president is ordering a licensed commercial applicator to intentionally apply a pesticide for off-label use to exterminate healthy, maintained honeybees?" "Yes, sir. I have the certified email from her stating exactly that. She's charging me $850 for the extermination." I heard the sound of a chair scraping across a floor, like Hank had just stood up abruptly. "Chem Scorched Earth," Hank muttered. "I know those clowns. They run those big white box trucks. They spray a proprietary mix heavy on atrazine and 2,4-D. It's incredibly drift-prone. If they spray that near open hives, it won't just kill the foragers. The bees will track the contaminated dust back in, and the whole colony will collapse in hours." "Exactly," I said. "I have the apiary registration paperwork completely filled out on my computer. I want to register my property as a state apiary to trigger FIFRA protections. But if I mail it, it won't be processed in time. Tomorrow morning they are going to kill my bees. Is there any way at all, that you can expedite an inspection today?" Hank didn't even hesitate. "Where are you located in Charlotte?" "Oakmont Drive, down in the Whispering Pines subdivision." "I am currently in Concord," Hank said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "I have an inspection at a commercial orchard at 9, but I am canceling it. Nobody messes with agricultural assets on my watch, and I absolutely despise commercial cowboys who think they can misuse pesticides. I will be at your house at 10:30 this morning. Have your paperwork printed." "Hank, you are a literal lifesaver." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Hank grumbled. "Just make sure those bees are flying when I get there." He hung up. I literally pumped my fist in the air. It was on. The state was officially getting involved. I spent the next 3 hours preparing for the inspection. I printed out the registration forms, I printed out a physical copy of Brenda's threatening email, and I went out back to make sure the hives looked pristine. At exactly 10:28 a.m., a heavy-duty white Ford F-250 pickup truck with the North Carolina state seal slapped on the door rolled down Oakmont Drive. It didn't pull into the driveway. It just parked aggressively on the street, taking up half the lane. A man stepped out. Hank was exactly what he sounded like on the phone. He was a tall, broad-shouldered guy, probably in his late 50s, wearing a tucked-in khaki uniform shirt with a state badge clipped to his belt, heavy denim jeans, and work boots. He had a graying mustache and a look of permanent, simmering annoyance etched into his face. He looked like a guy who had zero patience for suburban drama and even less patience for illegal pesticide use. I walked out the front door to meet him. "Hank?" "I'm Geyser. Thanks for getting here so fast." Hank didn't smile. He just gave a curt nod. "Let's see the girls." He didn't want coffee. He didn't want small talk. He just wanted to see the bees. I led him around the side of the house, through the gate of my vinyl fence, and into the backyard. Hank walked straight up to the hives. He didn't put on a bee suit. He didn't even put on a veil. He just reached into his back pocket, pulled out a battered metal hive tool, and popped the outer cover off the top hive. I stood back, watching him work. He was a total professional. He moved slowly, deliberately. He pulled out a frame covered in hundreds of crawling, buzzing bees. He held it up to the sunlight, his eyes scanning the wax cells. "Good brood pattern," he muttered to himself, pointing the hive tool at a tight circle of capped wax. "Queen's laying well. No sign of varroa mites, no sign of small hive beetles. These are strong, healthy, highly productive hives. Good Italian genetics, too." He gently slid the frame back in, replaced the inner cover, and put the roof back on. He turned to me, wiping a bit of propolis off his hands. "All right, son," Hank said, pulling a rugged, thick-cased Panasonic tablet out of a satchel he had slung over his shoulder. "You run a tight ship. These are beautiful hives. Hand me that paperwork." I handed him the printed registration forms. He didn't even really read them. He just used the tablet's camera to scan the documents directly into the state database. He tapped the screen with a thick finger a few times, waited for a loading wheel to spin, and then nodded. "Done," Hank said, looking up at me. "Your application is expedited and approved by my authority as a regional inspector. As of this exact second, this property is no longer just a residential backyard. You are an official North Carolina registered apiary. Your registration number is NC 44902. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since Tuesday. "So, legally speaking, Hank interrupted, you are now operating a recognized state agricultural asset, which means FIFRA applies, which means that landscaping company cannot touch this yard." Hank reached into the large satchel again. He pulled out 2 items that looked heavy and metallic. When he turned them around, I honestly think my heart skipped a beat. They were 2 large, heavy-gauge aluminum signs. They were painted a blinding, high-visibility hazard yellow. The text on them was printed in massive, bold, aggressive black lettering. Warning: North Carolina Registered Apiary, State Agricultural Asset, application of pesticides without strict adherence to NC Admin Code. 02 N2OC09L.1009 is a violation of state and federal law. Registration. Hank pulled a thick black permanent marker from his pocket and wrote my brand new apiary number in the blank space on both signs. He handed the heavy metal signs to me, along with a handful of thick, industrial-strength zip ties. "Mount these on your fence," Hank ordered. "I want one on the gate, right where anyone trying to enter the yard has to look at it. I want the other one facing the street, clearly visible from the curb. Do not hide them. Make sure they are the most obvious thing on your property." I took the signs. They felt like literal armor. "Will do. Now, about tomorrow morning," Hank said, crossing his arms and leaning against the oak tree. "You said they scheduled a hit for 8 a.m.? "Yes, sir. Chem-scorched earth landscaping." Hank reached into his front shirt pocket and pulled out a crisp, white business card with the state seal embossed on it. He handed it to me. "When that truck pulls up tomorrow," Hank instructed, his voice dropping into a deadly serious tone, "you do not yell at them. You do not threaten them. You walk up to the foreman, you hand him that card, and you calmly inform him that this property is a state-registered agricultural apiary." I nodded, absorbing every word. "You tell him," Hank continued, "that under FIFRA and state law, any application of their standard chemical mix within drift distance of these hives will result in an immediate investigation by the Department of Agriculture. You tell him that if 1 drop of pesticide lands on this property without a state-approved mitigation plan, I will personally see to it that his commercial applicator license and the license of his boss are revoked before lunch, and I will hand them over to the EPA for federal fines." "Will they actually believe me?" I asked, looking down at the card. "Will they just think I'm making it up to get out of the HOA rules?" Hank let out a dark, rumbling chuckle. "Son, commercial landscapers aren't scared of HOAs. They aren't scared of cops. But they are absolutely, fundamentally terrified of the Department of Agriculture. We hold the keys to their livelihood. Without a license, they can't operate. They won't just refuse to spray your yard. They will likely refuse to spray anywhere near your zip code until they clear it with us." "And what about Brenda?" I asked. "The HOA president. She's the one who ordered the hit." Hank put on a pair of dark aviator sunglasses. "HOA bylaws do not supersede federal environmental laws. Never have, never will. Your HOA president is about to find out that she's playing in a much bigger sandbox than she realizes, and she just picked a fight with the federal government. You set the trap, son. Let her walk right into it." Hank turned, walked back out through the gate, climbed into his heavy-duty state truck, and drove away, leaving me standing in my backyard holding the ultimate trump card. I mean, I stood there in the backyard for like a solid 10 minutes, just staring at those heavy metal signs in my hands. The sheer weight of them felt incredible. It was literally the physical manifestation of federal bureaucracy, and it was entirely on my side. Honestly, mounting them was probably the most satisfying home improvement project I have ever undertaken in my entire life. I grabbed the thickest, most heavy-duty industrial zip ties I owned from my garage. I didn't want Brenda to be able to just casually snip them off with a pair of crafting scissors if she decided to trespass in the middle of the night. I walked around to the front of the white vinyl fence. The HOA bylaws had an entire, painstakingly detailed section on the exact shade of white the fences were allowed to be. It had to be a specific, muted, eggshell matte finish. Anything glossy or off-white would result in an immediate fine. I took the first bright, hazard yellow, reflective metal sign and slapped it right on the front gate, exactly at eye level. I cinched the zip ties down so hard they dug into the plastic of the fence. Then, I took the second sign and walked to the corner of the property line that directly faced the street. I mounted that one facing completely outward, so that any vehicle driving down Oakmont Drive would literally have the warning reflecting off their headlights. It was aggressively ugly. The bright, construction zone yellow violently clashed with the pristine, muted, overly manicured aesthetic of the Whispering Pines subdivision. It was a massive, screaming eyesore, and it was completely, undeniably legally protected. I stepped back and admired my work. I guess I could have just stopped there and waited for the landscaping crew to show up the next morning, but that's not really my style. If you're going to execute a flawless, malicious compliance maneuver, you have to leave a paper trail. You have to give the other side the exact rope they need to hang themselves with. I went back inside, opened my laptop, and hit reply on the threatening email Brenda had sent me the night before. I made sure it was a reply all, keeping the rest of the HOA board and the property management company securely on the email chain. Honestly, drafting this email took me almost an hour because I wanted the tone to be absolutely, perfectly infuriating. I didn't want to explain the law to her. I didn't want to mention FIFRA or the federal fines or the EPA. If I warned her about the legal consequences, she might call off the landscaping company and find a different way to attack me. I wanted the contractors to show up. I wanted them to be on the property when the trap was sprung. So I kept it short. I kept it overwhelmingly polite. Dear Brenda and the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors, I am writing to formally acknowledge receipt of your notice regarding the dispatch of chem-scorched earth landscaping to my property tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Please be advised that as of this morning, my property has been formally classified and registered as an agricultural apiary with the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. Official state registration, honor Nyaharan Twars NC 44902. State-mandated hazard signage has been permanently affixed to the perimeter fencing to reflect this change in property status. I look forward to seeing the landscaping crew tomorrow morning. Warm regards, Geiser. I hit send. I literally smiled at the screen as the little swoosh sound played. She was going to read that email and think I was just playing a stupid sovereign citizen game. She was going to think that putting up a fake sign was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to scare off her contractors. She was going to be so blindingly overconfident. The rest of Thursday dragged by. I tried to do some work, but honestly, My focus was entirely shattered. I spent the afternoon prepping my camera gear. If I was going to humiliate a suburban dictator using the federal government, I was absolutely going to record it. I set up a small, discreet tripod on my front porch, perfectly angled down the driveway. I attached my phone, checked the battery, and made sure the microphone audio levels were dialed in. I barely slept that night. I was like a kid on Christmas Eve, except instead of waiting for Santa, I was waiting for a highly toxic chemical spray truck. Friday morning dawned bright, clear, and already uncomfortably humid. I was out of bed by 6:30 a.m. I made a massive pot of coffee, poured it into a travel mug, and walked out onto the front porch. I turned the camera on, hit record, and sat down in a wooden rocking chair. And then, I waited. The neighborhood was dead quiet. A few people were walking their dogs, casting very confused looks at the massive yellow hazard signs bolted to my fence. Dave, my neighbor, came out to grab his newspaper, took one look at the signs, gave me a thumbs up, and went right back inside. He knew something was going down. At exactly 7:45 a.m., the deep, rumbling sound of a heavy diesel engine shattered the quiet of the cul-de-sac. A massive white box truck turned the corner. Down the side of the truck, painted in aggressive, blocky green letters, was the logo for Chem-Scorched Earth Landscaping. The truck hissed loudly as the air brakes engaged, pulling right up to the curb, blocking half of my driveway. And right behind the truck, pulling up with the kind of aggressive speed usually reserved for police chases, was a pristine silver Lexus SUV. The Lexus parked illegally, right across the street, its front tires resting firmly on the curb. The driver's door popped open, and out stepped Brenda. I mean, she had actually dressed up for the occasion. She was wearing her pristine white tennis skirt, a matching white visor, and she was clutching her signature aluminum clipboard to her chest like a shield. She looked incredibly smug. She looked like a general arriving at a battlefield right after the enemy had already surrendered. She slammed the door of the Lexus, power-walked across the street, and took up a position on the sidewalk right at the edge of my property line. She crossed her arms, tapped her foot, and glared at me sitting on the porch. "I see you didn't remove the pests," she called out, projecting her voice so loudly it practically echoed off the houses. She wanted the landscaping crew to hear her. She wanted an audience. "Well, you were warned. The extermination fee is already pending on your ledger." I didn't say a single word to her. I didn't even look at her. I just took a long, slow sip of my coffee, stood up from the rocking chair, and started walking down the driveway. 3 guys had piled out of the cab of the landscaping truck. They were all wearing those heavy, thick green canvas coveralls, knee-high rubber boots, and thick rubber gloves. They looked hot, miserable, and completely bored. One of the guys walked to the back of the truck and started unspooling a massive, heavy-duty industrial hose that was hooked up to a massive chemical tank sitting inside the truck bed. You could literally smell the bleach and the pesticides radiating off the equipment. The foreman, a burly, bearded guy with a pair of safety glasses resting on top of his head, was standing by the cab, holding a battered tablet. I walked right past Brenda, completely ignoring her indignant scoff, and walked straight up to the foreman. "Morning," I said, my voice completely calm, pleasant and entirely conversational. "You guys the crew scheduled for the 8 a.m. spray at 442 Oakmont?" The foreman looked up from his tablet, squinting at me against the morning sun. "Yeah, that's us. HOA work order. We got a full property chemical blanket scheduled, plus an emergency targeted pest eradication in the rear yard." "Great," I said. I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out the crisp white business card that Hank had given me, and held it out to him. The foreman blinked, looking down at the card in my hand, completely confused. He didn't take it right away. "What's this?" "That," I said, keeping my tone perfectly light, "is the direct cellular contact information for Hank Miller. He is the regional inspector for the North Carolina Department of Agriculture." The foreman slowly took the card. He read the state seal embossed on it. His brow furrowed. "I just wanted to formally, verbally notify you," I continued, pitching my voice up just a fraction of an decibel, so that Brenda, who was practically vibrating with rage 10 feet away, could hear every single word clearly. Before you pull the trigger on that spray wand, that as of yesterday morning, this property is a state-registered agricultural apiary. I paused for dramatic effect, then raised my hand and pointed a finger toward the bright yellow metal sign bolted to my front gate. The foreman's eyes followed my finger. He squinted. Then he took 2 steps closer to the fence to read the bold black lettering. I literally watched his posture change. It was like someone had dropped an ice cube down the back of his canvas coveralls. Because this is an active, registered apiary, I explained casually, it is protected under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Applying any chemical that is toxic to honeybees within a drift radius of this property without prior state approval and strict drift mitigation protocols is a massive federal violation. The foreman stopped reading the sign and slowly turned his head back to look at me. His eyes were wide. Inspector Hank informed me yesterday, I added, offering a polite smile, that the fine is $25,000 per violation. He also asked me to let you know that if a single drop of that unapproved weed killer lands on my grass, he will immediately revoke the commercial applicator license of whoever is holding that hose, and he will pull your company's operating license before noon. The foreman absolutely froze. He looked down at the business card in his hand. He looked at the heavy industrial hose his crew member was currently dragging across my driveway. He looked back at the sign. Brenda couldn't take it anymore. The lack of immediate destruction was driving her crazy. "Don't listen to him!" she shrieked, marching aggressively onto my driveway and pointing a manicured finger at my face. "He is making things up. He bought those signs on the internet. Those are unauthorized pets. They are a community hazard, and the HOA board has officially ordered you to spray." The foreman didn't even look at Brenda. He didn't acknowledge her existence. He was staring at me, a look of genuine panic starting to set into his features. "You registered them with the Department of Agriculture?" the foreman asked, his voice suddenly sounding very tight. "The official registration number is printed in permanent marker right on the bottom of the sign," I said, nodding toward it. "You are more than welcome to call Hank at that number right now to verify. I highly recommend that you do. But I promise you, if that hose gets pressurized, I am handing him my security footage, and your career in landscaping is permanently over." The foreman looked down at the hose. He looked at the guy dragging it. "Drop it!" the foreman barked, his voice suddenly loud and frantic. "Hey, drop the hose! Do not pressurize that line!" The crew member looked confused, but he dropped the heavy brass nozzle onto the concrete of the driveway with a loud clatter. The foreman pulled a bulky 2-way radio off his belt. His hands were actually shaking a little bit. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, he said into the radio, his voice strained. "Yeah, we got a massive situation at the Oakmont job. I need to completely halt operations. Yeah, the property is a registered state apiary. No, I am not joking. The yellow agricultural signs are bolted to the fence. The homeowner just handed me the regional inspector's card." The radio crackled with static for a second before a voice replied. "Unit 4, say again? The HOA ordered a hit on a registered apiary?" "Yes," the foreman yelled into the radio. "No, I am absolutely not spraying. I am not getting hit with a FIFRA violation for a residential weed contract. Get the boss on the phone right now." Brenda's face went through a truly fascinating, horrifying spectrum of colors. She went from her usual flushed pink to a stark, bloodless white, and finally settled on a deep, mottled, furious shade of purple. "What are you doing?" she demanded, stepping directly into the foreman's personal space. She was so angry she was practically spitting. "You have a legally binding contract with the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. You are legally obligated to spray this property right now, or you are in breach of contract." The foreman finally looked at her. The panic in his eyes vanished, instantly replaced by absolute, unbridled rage. "Lady," the foreman snarled, his voice dropping an octave, "I do not care about your little neighborhood contract. That sign right there means the actual government is involved. If I spray this yard, I lose my commercial license. My boss loses his entire business, and the EPA comes down on us with federal fines that will bankrupt us in a week. I am the president of this association, Brenda screamed, stamping her foot on the concrete like a toddler. I will sue your company for breach of contract. I will make sure you never work in this county again. Go right ahead and try, the foreman shot back, waving his arms in disgust. But I'm not committing a federal crime over a lawn care dispute. The radio on his belt crackled loudly. Unit 4, this is the boss. Pack up the rig immediately. Do not deploy chemicals on that property. Get the crew back to the shop. Copy that, the foreman said. He turned to his crew. Roll the hoses. Pack it up. We're leaving. You cannot leave, Brenda shrieked. She literally ran forward and physically placed herself between the landscaping truck and the crew member who was trying to reel the hose back in. I am ordering you to finish this job. The foreman let out a breath, looking at Brenda with a mix of utter disbelief and profound pity. Move out of the way, lady, the foreman warned, or I am calling the cops. I'm already calling them, Brenda screamed, pulling her cell phone out of her pocket and furiously jabbing at the screen. I am having you arrested for breach of contract, and I am having him arrested for agricultural terrorism. I just leaned back against the pillar of my porch, took another sip of my coffee, and smiled. Honestly, it was unfolding exactly the way I had planned, but even I couldn't have predicted she would try to physically blockade a commercial landscaping truck. But here's the kicker. The absolute cherry on top of this beautiful, malicious Sunday. The foreman wasn't just pulling his guys out of my yard. Wait, I called out, stepping off the porch and walking back down the driveway. I needed to make sure the trap closed completely. Before you guys roll out, I just want to clarify something with you. The foreman stopped, looking at me warily. What? State regulations regarding registered apiaries require a massive drift-free buffer zone, I explained, gesturing broadly to Dave's house next door and then across the street to the other lawns. Your standard chemical mix, the one you use for the Lush Lawns program, it's highly prone to wind drift. If you spray the houses next door or the houses across the street, the wind will absolutely carry that chemical dust to my hives. The foreman stared at me. You could literally see the gears turning in his head. Under FIFRA, I continued calmly, that is still considered a direct violation. To legally and safely spray this neighborhood now that an apiary is present, your company is going to have to switch to a completely different, bee-safe, organic chemical mixture, which I know for a fact is way outside the budget of this HOA contract. Plus, you have to formally notify me 48 hours in advance of any application within a 1-mile radius so I can lock the bees inside. The foreman just blinked. The reality of the situation washed over him like a tidal wave. Because I had registered my backyard hives, the entire massive cookie-cutter subdivision of Whispering Pines was now legally classified as a protected agricultural zone. The landscaping company could no longer fulfill their mandatory neighborhood-wide contract without completely overhauling their entire operational protocol and risking catastrophic federal fines. I hadn't just saved my bees. I had legally poisoned the well for the entire Lush Lawns program. Hey, boss, the foreman said into the radio, his voice sounding hollow. Yeah, it's Unit 4 again. You're going to need to call the lawyers. We can't spray the neighborhood today, or, ever again. What do you mean you can't spray the neighborhood? Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking. It means, the foreman yelled back at her, completely losing his temper, that because you didn't tell us this guy had a state apiary, we can't legally operate in this subdivision. You breached the contract, lady. We're done here. He grabbed the heavy brass nozzle of the hose from his crew member, tossed it into the back of the truck, and slammed the heavy metal doors shut. Get in the truck, he barked at the other guys. I am standing right here, Brenda screamed, refusing to move from behind the truck's rear bumper. You run me over, it's murder. The foreman just shook his head, walked around to the driver's side, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. He didn't even try to back up. He just threw the massive box truck into drive, cranked the wheel all the way to the left, and aggressively hopped the curb, driving straight over a patch of Brenda's precious manicured neighborhood grass to get around her. The truck roared out of the cul-de-sac, leaving deep tire ruts in the turf, fleeing the scene as fast as legally possible. And then there was silence, just the sound of the morning birds, the gentle hum of my bees waking up in the backyard, and the ragged, heavy breathing of the HOA president. Brenda stood completely alone in the middle of the street. She was clutching her phone in one hand and her clipboard in the other. Her chest was heaving. She looked frantically down the street where the truck had disappeared, then turned slowly to look at me. She had played her hand. She had tried to use the absolute, crushing weight of the HOA bylaws to ruin my day. And in response, I had used the federal government to break her most prized possession. "You," Brenda stammered, her voice shaking with an unholy mixture of rage and shock. You terrorist." I just smiled, raised my coffee mug in a little toast, and took a sip. "Have a great morning, Brenda," I said politely. But I guess she really had dialed 911 during her meltdown, because about 5 minutes later, before she could even storm off the property, a police cruiser turned onto Oakmont Drive. I mean, I honestly almost felt bad for the cop. Almost. The cruiser pulled to a stop right behind Brenda's illegally parked Lexus, the red and blue lights flashing lazily against the morning sun. The driver's side door opened, and I watched as the same older, deeply exhausted officer from Tuesday afternoon slowly climbed out. He stood up, adjusted his duty belt, and just looked at the scene. He looked at the massive tire ruts the landscaping truck had torn into the corner of the manicured grass. He looked at Brenda, who was standing in the middle of the street looking like a crazed Wimbledon spectator. And then he looked at me, still sitting on my porch, holding my travel mug. He didn't say anything for a solid 10 seconds. He just took off his sunglasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and let out a sigh that I could literally hear from 40 feet away. Brenda didn't even give him a chance to speak. She practically sprinted toward him. "Officer!" she shrieked, pointing her clipboard at me like a bayonet. "Arrest him! Arrest that man right now! He is engaging in agricultural terrorism. He put up fake government signs, and he just conspired with a commercial landscaping company to breach a legally binding HOA contract." The officer held up one single gloved hand, palm out, stopping her tirade in its tracks. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion, "please step out of the middle of the roadway. Now." Brenda huffed, indignantly stepping onto the curb. But she didn't stop talking. "You need to dispatch units to chase down a chem-scorched earth landscaping truck. They just committed felony property damage by driving over the grass, and they are refusing to complete an emergency landscaping intervention that I legally ordered." The officer slowly walked up my driveway, completely ignoring her, and stopped at the edge of the grass. He looked at the massive, bright yellow Department of Agriculture sign, zip-tied to my fence. He read it. Then he looked at me. "Sir," he said, sounding like a man who was actively counting down the days until his pension kicked in. "Please tell me why I am back here at 8 in the morning on a Friday." "Good morning, officer," I said cheerfully, walking down the steps. "The signs aren't fake. I officially registered my hives as a state agricultural apiary yesterday. Inspector Hank from the Department of Agriculture came out, verified them, and issued the signage. I have the digital paperwork right here on my phone if you want to see it." "I don't," the officer said quickly. "Well, because it's a registered apiary," I continued. "It's protected by the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Brenda here tried to use a landscaping crew to forcefully spray my yard with toxic chemicals, specifically to kill my bees. I informed the contractors that spraying without state clearance is a massive federal violation. They realized she was trying to force them to break the law, so they voided the contract, packed up, and left. She got mad and tried to physically block their truck, which is why they hopped the curb?" The officer slowly turned his head to look at Brenda. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting from exhausted to dangerously serious. "Did you attempt to order a commercial crew to spray toxic pesticides on a property bearing state agricultural warning signs?" "They are an unauthorized nuisance!" Brenda shrieked, completely missing the legal danger she was in. "The HOA bylaws clearly state—" "I don't give a single damn about your bylaws, Brenda," the officer interrupted, raising his voice just enough to shut her down. It was the first time I had heard him sound actually angry. "You cannot mandate a federal crime. If you try to force a commercial contractor to violate EPA and state pesticide regulations, that is way, way above my pay grade, but I guarantee you the State Environmental Division will absolutely destroy you in court." "It's an HOA mandate," she stammered, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a life preserver. "It's a civil dispute that you tried to escalate into an environmental hazard," the officer shot back. He pulled out a small notepad. "The contractor's leaving was a civil contract dispute. Them driving over the grass was a traffic incident, which I am not citing them for because you were illegally detaining them in the roadway. And as for you," he pointed his pen at me, "your bees are perfectly legal, your signs are perfectly legal, and I am officially logging this call as a civil nuisance complaint." He snapped the notepad shut. "If you call 911 again regarding this man's bugs, I will personally cite you for misuse of the emergency dispatch system. Go home, ma'am." Brenda stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She looked at the cop. She looked at the tire tracks. She looked at the bright yellow sign. And then, without saying another word, she turned around, got into her illegally parked Lexus, and drove away so fast her tires squealed. The officer watched her go, then looked back at me. He actually cracked a very small, very tired smile. "Agricultural terrorism?" he muttered, shaking his head. "That's a new one. Have a good weekend, sir." "You too, officer," I laughed. He drove away, and the neighborhood was finally, truly quiet. But the fallout was literally just getting started. I mean, the sheer speed at which Brenda's empire crumbled over the next week was a thing of absolute beauty. By noon that Friday, the landscaping company's boss had called the HOA Property Management Group and formally, aggressively terminated the entire Lush Lawns contract. He didn't just cite breach of contract. He cited an unsafe legal environment and a failure to disclose a protected agricultural zone. And because he was legally obligated to report attempted pesticide violations, he also called the state. On Tuesday, the HOA board received a massive, certified, absolutely terrifying warning letter from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, completely backing up Hank, the apiary inspector. The letter basically stated that any further attempts by the board to mandate chemical spraying within a 1-mile radius of registration NC 44,902 without following state-approved drift protocols would result in immediate catastrophic fines against the HOA as an entity, which meant the mandatory neighborhood-wide toxic weed killer program was dead. Completely, utterly, legally dead. And you know what happened when word got out? The neighborhood threw a literal digital parade. The Nextdoor app and the private Facebook group were absolutely chaotic. People who had been silently suffering under Brenda's reign of terror for years were suddenly realizing that the Wicked Witch had lost her powers. Nobody wanted the chemical sprays anyway. Dave, my neighbor, actually baked me a batch of chocolate chip cookies and brought them over. "I mean, I knew you were crazy for fighting her," Dave told me, leaning over the fence while I was checking the hives on Wednesday afternoon. "But weaponizing the federal EPA to cancel our landscaping fees? That is the most unhinged, brilliant thing I have ever seen in my life. My wife is literally out front planting a vegetable garden right now because she doesn't have to worry about the poison trucks." "Just doing my civic duty, Dave," I joked. But obviously, the HOA board had to respond. They were in breach of their own bylaws, which promised community lawn care, and they had just lost a massive stream of revenue because they could no longer legally collect the $100 monthly fee for a service that was now physically impossible to perform. So they called an emergency town hall meeting for Thursday night at the community clubhouse. The subject line of the email was simply, "Leadership Restructuring and the Lush Lawns Program Suspension." I arrived at the clubhouse 15 minutes early, and I was shocked. The place was absolutely packed. I'm talking standing room only. Usually, HOA meetings are attended by maybe 5 or 6 incredibly bored retirees who want to complain about trash can placement. Tonight, there were at least 100 people crammed into the room. The energy wasn't angry. It was electric. It felt like a mutiny. I took a seat in the back row next to Dave. At the front of the room, sitting behind a long folding table, was the HOA board. It consisted of 3 very sweaty, very nervous-looking guys in polo shirts, and Brenda. Brenda looked awful. She wasn't wearing her usual tennis outfit. She was wearing a rigid, high-collared blouse, and she looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She was staring blankly at her clipboard, refusing to make eye contact with the crowd. Greg, the vice president of the board, a guy who constantly looked like he was suffering from extreme acid reflux, tapped the microphone to call the meeting to order. "All right, folks, settle down, please," Greg said, his voice echoing off the cheap acoustic tiles. "We have a highly sensitive situation to discuss. As I'm sure you are all aware, the Lush Lawns landscaping crews will no longer be servicing Whispering Pines." A loud, genuine cheer erupted from the back of the room. Greg held up his hands, looking pained. "Please, we need to maintain order," Greg pleaded. "This isn't just about losing a vendor. The HOA board is currently under review by the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. We have been blacklisted by every commercial landscaping company in Mecklenburg County. They consider our neighborhood to be a massive legal liability." The room went quiet. "This is because," Greg continued, turning his head to glare directly at Brenda, completely throwing her under the bus. "An officer of this board unilaterally attempted to coerce a licensed contractor into illegally spraying toxic chemicals onto a state-registered agricultural apiary located within our subdivision." Literally everyone in the room turned around in their chairs and looked directly at me. I just offered a small, polite wave and took a sip from a water bottle. Dave was practically vibrating with suppressed laughter beside me. "Because of this reckless and unauthorized action," Greg said, reading from a prepared statement, "the Lush Lawns mandate is permanently suspended. Your monthly HOA dues will be immediately decreased by $100. The room completely lost it. People were clapping, whistling, and high-fiving. Taking $100 a month out of the pockets of an HOA and putting it back into the residents' bank accounts is basically the suburban equivalent of winning the lottery. Brenda finally snapped. She grabbed the microphone right out of Greg's hands. Her face flushed that deep, dangerous magenta. "This is not a victory!" she screamed into the mic, causing a horrible feedback loop that made everyone cover their ears. "This neighborhood is going to fall into absolute disrepair. We are going to have weeds in the sidewalks. The property values will plummet, and it is entirely his fault." She pointed a violently shaking finger directly at me in the back row. "He circumvented the rules. He harbored flying menaces, and he put fake government signs on his fence to destroy this community." I didn't yell back. I didn't get mad. I just stood up slowly. The entire room went dead silent, waiting to see what the guy who just legally dismantled the HOA was going to say. "I didn't circumvent anything, Brenda," I said, my voice projecting easily across the quiet room. "I followed the law, the actual law, not the little spiral-bound notebook you use to bully people. You tried to force commercial contractors to break federal environmental regulations to kill my property, and when they refused to commit a crime for you, you threw a tantrum in the middle of the street." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The state didn't blacklist this neighborhood because I have bees," I finished calmly. "They blacklisted this neighborhood because they realized the president of the HOA is a massive legal liability." The silence held for exactly 2 seconds before Dave jumped out of his chair. "I make a motion!" Dave yelled, his voice booming. "I make a formal motion to hold an immediate vote of no confidence regarding Brenda's position on the board, effective right now." Seconded, yelled a woman near the front. Thirded, shouted a guy in the back. You cannot do that, Brenda shrieked, clutching the microphone so hard her knuckles turned white. This is an emergency informational session. It is not an election cycle. Section 12 of the bylaws clearly states— Actually, Brenda, Greg interrupted, firmly grabbing the microphone back from her. Section 12, paragraph C, allows for immediate board restructuring by a majority vote of present members if an officer engages in gross negligence that exposes the association to extreme financial or legal jeopardy, which you absolutely did. Greg looked out at the sea of angry residents. All those in favor of immediately removing Brenda from the office of president and from the HOA board of directors entirely, please raise your hand. I mean, I have never seen a vote pass so fast in my life. Every single hand in the room shot up into the air. Even the other two board members sitting at the table raised their hands. It was unanimous. Brenda looked at the hands. She looked at Greg. Her jaw actually dropped open. For the first time since I had met her, the woman was completely and utterly speechless. The realization that she had zero power left, that her precious clipboard was now totally meaningless, finally hit her. She didn't argue. She didn't yell. She just grabbed her purse, stood up, and power-walked out the side door of the clubhouse, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind her. The room erupted into a standing ovation. After the meeting officially adjourned, people were milling around, chatting excitedly about how they were going to fire up their grills this weekend without smelling bleach, and planning out new garden beds. I walked up to the front table. Greg was packing up his binders, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked exhausted, but like a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "Hey, Greg," I said. He looked up, offering a tired, slightly wary smile. "Hey, man. Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot with the citations and everything." "Don't worry about it," I said. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a small, heavy glass mason jar filled with thick, bright amber liquid, and set it on the plastic folding table. First harvest of the season. I figured the new acting president of the board could use something sweet after dealing with all that. Greg looked down at the jar of fresh, perfectly capped honey. He let out a genuine laugh and shook his head. "Thanks," Greg said, picking up the jar. "And hey, for the record, the bees are fine. Keep them as long as you want. Just please don't call the federal government on us ever again." "As long as nobody tries to poison my yard," I smiled, turning to walk out, "we won't have any problems at all." So, honestly, if there's one thing you take away from this, it's that when someone tries to use petty, fake, suburban authority to step on your rights, you don't just complain about it. You dig into the fine print. You find the exact federal statute they are violating, and you make absolutely sure that when you tell them to buzz off, you have the entire Department of Agriculture backing up your sting. Anyway, let's see how this plays out for the next guy who tries to test us. Have fun with this one. It's a ride.